My name is Mihail Mateev, and I will talk about Cosmos DB Serverless. How many of you have experience with Cosmos DB Serverless? Okay. So we can have discussions. Feel free to ask me anytime about some specifics. We will cover several topics related mostly to what is Cosmos DB Serverless, what you can get like advantage, and samples, use cases and samples. Hope that time will be enough to show the most important. So, how many of you work with Cosmos DB, by the way? Again, some people. Okay. Probably you know that Cosmos DB Serverless is a concept which was introduced 2 years ago and in 2021, and it doesn't cover Postgre API. All NoSQL APIs, but for now not Postgre. And what is interesting here, we will see there are some specifics regarding to multi-region, regarding to serverless, and also there are some specifics regarding to SLA. That's the reason to put these slides here. Many people without experience have initially some doubts what is exactly Cosmos DB Serverless, because Cosmos DB in general is serverless application. In general, you don't care about what you will have behind the stage. But here, serverless is the mostly up to the pricing model and some specifics around this, of course. And what is interesting here, when you need to use Cosmos DB Serverless. I will go back a little later in this presentation. Usually, if you have constantly high demand regarding to the workload, you can use existing from the beginning plans with reserved capacity. But if you have high deviation in workloads, depends on specifics in your work, some short moments when you have high load, and after that you have relatively low load, which is good, for example, for backend solutions. Almost all backend solutions for enterprises now can use this. It is possible, of course, to use it also for development. It is possible to use it for different solutions, like, for example, IoT solutions, not for manufacturing, but for smart homes and some places where you have not very high load. In this case, Cosmos DB can be much more cheaper, and I will explain why. You need to consider how to optimize the cost. Usually with Cosmos DB, most of people have initially different experience because default settings usually are not the most optimized regarding to the price, and also for some operations regarding to the performance. And this leads to a little bit different impressions from people who are starting to work with Cosmos DB. So I will try to help you to change this, and to be not with people who have doubts about Cosmos DB features. So when you want to talk about Cosmos DB Serverless, it is when you need to have solution where to pay on demand. That means you will pay only for resources which you are using. No need of reserved capacity, no need to think about some commitment. And this is exactly what we will get here. Usually, this is ideal for low demand solutions and with solutions with high deviation, as I already explained. Also, there are some limits which we will discuss a little bit later. Many people also are asking me why to use serverless when we have options also to use free tier. Free tier is quite limited. For each subscription, you can have Azure subscription. You can have one Cosmos DB free tier subscription where you have these limitations. It is not enough for many scenarios which you can have for Cosmos DB serverless. And we need to see how price model is working in this way. So, usually when we have no need of specific commitment and go to Cosmos DB serverless, we need to consider these limitations. 5,000 request units per second. By the way, how many of you are aware what exactly means one request unit? I will go back to this. Request units is very similar to DTU. Probably you know DTU about Azure SQL database. And it is a subjective metric which allows to compare throughput, but it is something which cannot be measured very precisely for many of use cases. And about the storage, initially there was limitation for 50 gigabytes. Now it's 1 terabyte storage for all collections. That means if you go with Cosmos DB serverless for the subscription where you are using Cosmos DB serverless, you can have currently maximum 1 terabyte. You know that for Cosmos DB, you have no limit. You can have as much data as you want. And of course, this data also affects what you will pay. So here we have these specifics for now. If you have huge amount of data, probably Cosmos DB serverless is not the best one for your solutions. And if you are considering to use relational databases, that means Postgre API, also you will have need to go to another solution. So this is probably one of the most important things. Another one is multi-region support. For multi-region support, we have still some limitations. When you go with Cosmos DB serverless, you can have several zones. You can have multi-zone support, but not multi-region for now. And you can understand why, because you are paying on demand, and it will be more difficult also to be realized, to have multi-region support in such kind of situations. Probably we will have in the future, but I'm just explaining that logically you will understand why it is difficult to have such kind of feature from the beginning. And also, it is not possible to change the accounts. You need to stay to the same account. In Cosmos DB, you know, account is actually logical abstraction. So that means you can have different accounts, accounts which are for serverless subscriptions need to be separate. And you can have in one Azure subscription many accounts for Cosmos DB, which you can split to accounts for reserved capacity and accounts for serverless subscriptions. Also, you have no need to provision throughput, but you have limit in the pikes. It is not possible currently to have more than 5,000 request units per second. That means for high-load solutions, probably you will hit this limitation. It is possible, of course, if it is only the one limitation, to have several subscriptions to split the load, but in general, it is more difficult situation. So for high-load solutions, it will be not the best option. What additionally is good to know? I will want to go a little bit ahead because we have no time. Just to compare, you have some limitations also regarding to the latency. I will show you now demos. It is almost not possible to realize the difference, but technically for not only high-load solutions, but for solutions with very strict requirement for very small latency, it could be a case, and this is something which also you need to consider like limitations. How we will make this charging analysis? I will go again a little forward, and we'll show you. So, one request unit usually is represented with 1 kilobyte JSON with up to 10 properties, quite abstract and quite subjective. That means you need to have relatively small JSON, and if you have different operations, you will have different number of request units for reading, for updating, for deleting. When we have billing model, for provision throughput, you need to pay for two parameters. You need to pay for the storage, and you need to pay for provision throughput. If we go into different details, which you know probably, when we go to different options for provision throughput, you can have autopilot mode. Autopilot was introduced 4 or 5 years ago, and you can have flexible throughput, but you will pay a little bit more for this, and you can have reserve capacity for a long time, and in this way you can have also some cost reduction. But when we go back to provision throughput, I will go a little bit forward, we need to consider how much we will need to pay regarding to request units. And here, I'm showing approximately for reading of this document 1 request unit, for writing 5, and updating is also similarly to the writing. When we have limitations regarding to the provision throughput, you will be able here to have some kind of flexible area where if you go a little bit on top of the limit for provision throughput, you will not receive error messages because of the throttling. But if you have serverless mode, actually you have not this scenario, but if you go up to 5,000 request units, you will be able to you will not be able to have this flexibility. So, numbers usually show better what exactly is the goal of one presentation. So imagine that we have such kind of situation. We have workload with not very high pikes, for example, up to 500 request units. That means, for example, to read 500 JSONs with 1 kilobyte per second. And we have totally 20 million, in this case, request units. If we make some calculations, you need to pay nearly $30 when you are using provision throughput and $5 when you are using serverless. So for such kind of workloads, you can make really cost reduction using serverless approach. But if we go to more critical workloads, where for the month you have, for example, 250 million request units, you see that already serverless mode stay more expensive. What is important? For now, in the pricing model, you have 25 cents per million request units. And it is the main metric. No need to calculate anything different. And you can have pretty clear these numbers regarding to your workload. So 2 things are important. Never to have pikes more than 5,000 request units. Again, it is subjective depending on your data, on the size of your messages, because request units will be different, and your structure. And it is good also to know that always when you are up to several 100 million request units, you are starting to go less and less attractive compared to provision throughput. And the third one is storage. For now, you have 1 terabyte storage. It is possible pretty easy, based on the consumption, to check this. Now, we have just overviewed the cases, and I will show you demos. When we can use such kind of solutions, when you do some learning, discovery, research, development, applications where you can make predictions at the beginning, after that you can change it, when pikes really are no high percentage of the whole workload, and also quite often it is possible to use these implementations with other serverless components in Azure, like Azure Functions, because actually in this case you will have several components triggered on demand, by request, and usually you will have event-driven solution designed in this way much more effective. Now it is time for demos. So let's go first to one example, which is performance test, actually, with Azure Cosmos DB with table API. I will not go now into details because we have not much time, but I will try to run this solution. And we have several operations: a creation of a new container, inserting records, running again the same query, making a query against another index, because probably you know in Cosmos DB table API use the same syntax like Azure storage, which is table storage, but we can have several things more. One of the things is to have indexing on many fields, which is really slightly different. And now I'm going to make the same with serverless solution. And we will compare numbers. Numbers are quite subjective because it depends also on the distance to data centers where you deploy Cosmos DB. But you will see that for at least most of scenarios, you cannot feel the difference. So you need to have some very high requirements regarding to response time. For example, to feel any difference. So let's try to compare it, and I have one more demo before to finish. Again, you can see that we have quite similar numbers. because cloud is actually changing every moment the state, it is not possible to make it like statistical analysis without running of many different subsets of data with the same scenario. But you can see numbers are pretty clear. And now another example, which probably will be more interesting for you because it is not a standard. I am using Cosmos DB serverless with IoT solution with something which usually you don't consider, and it is Power Automate. We have no time. Is it fine 1 minute more to show you this demo? Okay. So, I have simulator here. I'm running simulator where we have messages which are going to IoT Hub. Power Platform and especially Power Automate can be used also with IoT Hub, Event Hub. If you are interested, later we can discuss. I will run this test. This flow is processing data and saving data into Cosmos DB. It is good for solutions with not high workload. You can use Power Platform and some solutions which are mostly in the context of business application. And exactly in this scenario, you can have such kind of solutions. So we have no time, just waiting last seconds to see the results, and that's all. Thank you very much for attending.